Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for attending this webinar hosted by me, Leslie, and Ryan. The title, obviously, is an introduction to the Arkansas NRCS Pollinator Conservation Planning Handbook, a document that all three of us worked on, but we'll tell you about many of the other people who worked on this new document. It's been a big project. I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm Ray Moranz. I'm a pollinator ecologist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and I'm a partner biologist with the NRCS Central National Technology Support Center in Fort Worth, Texas. Even though I work for the Fort Worth office, I live in Stillwater, Oklahoma with my wife and kids. Leslie, of course, is with QF and is at the Arkansas NRCS State Office, as is Ryan Diener, and each of them will give their titles when they introduce themselves. So why pollinators? Why should we care so much about pollinators to write a really large document on them? Well, they pollinate most flowers. More than 85% of flowering plants require animals, usually insects, to move their pollen. Pollinators also sustain our health and economy. Of course, many of the healthiest foods we eat, namely the fruits and vegetables with vitamins and minerals, are from insect-pollinated plants, and the value of the crops produced in the U.S. each year is over $30 billion. It's billion with a B. So all the fruits and vegetables you see in this photo and many more, we are reliant on insect pollinators to help produce those produce. And an example of a particularly important pollinator that you probably haven't heard about are the squash bees. Squash bees are native bees. They look a bit like honeybees, but they're not. They're different. They're in a different group. And they nest in soil under squash plants. They pollinate flowers before the honeybees begin foraging. So it turns out that they're a little bit better than honeybees at pollinating squash and other plants in that family, like zucchini, watermelon, things like that. In a study way back in the day by Tepedino found that 67% of sites studied across the U.S. had all of their pollination needs met by squash bees. So we really need to help these guys if we want to help farmers growing squash and things in the squash family. Another reason to care about pollinators, they sustain healthy ecosystems. Pollinators are an important part of the food web. They provide food for animals higher up on the food chain. Obviously, caterpillars get eaten by birds. Sometimes even big creatures like bears will eat them. And of course, the seeds and fruits that pollinators help to create through their pollination activities, those end up as being food for wildlife like birds, bears, etc. Another very important reason to protect pollinators is because we have to. Congress requires us to conserve pollinators via the Farm Bill. It was the 2008 Farm Bill that first made pollinator habitat conservation a big priority for USDA. But the 2014 and 2018 Farm Bills affirmed that. And since 2008, Farm Bill was passed, USDA has provided many millions to farmers and ranchers to help with pollinator conservation. And I'm happy to say that it's not that hard to go out and see the fruits of the labor. I myself have been on some amazing properties where field staff did hard work with ranchers, and particularly here in Oklahoma where I live. That's where I spend most of my time. And I've seen amazing pollinator habitat get created. But obviously not just here in Oklahoma. So we need to care about pollinators because they help us, they help wildlife, and we're required to do it. It's an urgent issue because the plight of native pollinators is pretty serious. They are declining at an alarming rate. At least 28% of bumblebee species are threatened. Now, I'm skipping a step. Maybe you thought there was a bumblebee out there, one type of bumblebee. turns out there are 47 species of bumblebees in the United States. And of those 47 species, about 28% of them are threatened. Bumblebees happen to be amazingly effective pollinators of certain crops, particularly tomatoes, blueberries, and some others. Butterflies, on average, aren't quite as good at pollinating as bees, but over 17% of all North American butterfly species are in trouble. And by the way, I have no image on this, but a very recent study came out, showed that butterflies are actually really good at pollinating cotton, which obviously is an important crop here in the south central US. Many factors are contributing to pollinator declines: habitat loss, poor land management, et cetera, et cetera. I want you to know that there are some very rare pollinators in the US, including in Arkansas. For instance, the rattlesnake master borer moth. This is a moth that lays its eggs on the rattlesnake master plant or near it. The eggs hatch and the caterpillars drill into the roots, into the base of the stem of the plant, and eat it up a little bit. They're totally dependent on that plant. And these have become quite rare. So I've told you why we need to help pollinators. Why a handbook? Well, I think the idea, other states came up with the idea years ago, but only a few. West Virginia, Kentucky, I know of those states having their own handbooks, but most states do not. But Helen Denniston and other leadership with Arkansas NRCS wanted to provide Arkansas NRCS field staff with a one-stop shop, a place where field staff could go to learn just about anything they wanted to know about the crops that depend on pollinators, pollinator biology, pollinator habitat, how to protect those pollinators, how to create new habitat for them, how to manage that habitat, what NRCS practices to recommend when doing conservation planning, what seeds to plant, and information on the vendors to make it easier for producers. So this handbook that we have created is that one-stop shop. We hope that it proves very useful for you. Where can you find it? We are happy to say that it has been posted on the Arkansas NRCS FOTG website. So specifically, if you look on the left, if you go to the Field Office Technical Guide website and go down to section 4 in Ecological Sciences Tools, then look over to the right. Down at the bottom of Ecological Sciences Tools, you can see just second from the bottom, the Arkansas NRCS Pollinator Handbook. So that document is posted on the FOTG. Hopefully all of you received a copy via email, and I'm happy to announce that just yesterday, 200 printed copies arrived at the state office in Little Rock. I don't know anything about who gets those copies. As far as I know, I'm not getting one. I wish I did, but I look forward to hearing about how those getting distributed out to field staff. Okay, some facts about the handbook. It was requested by Helen Denniston, your SRC. It's been in development since late 2018, and it is 185 pages of pure pollinator information goodness. It is huge. It is jam-packed with information and gorgeous photos. And I think I need to acknowledge, I will certainly acknowledge later, the photographers who contributed. The creation of this document was coordinated by my former colleague, Dr. Nancy Adamson of the Xerces Society, who was also a partner biologist like me with NRCS. She was located at the East National Technology Support Center in North Carolina. I'm using the terms "was" because just yesterday, she started a new job in Morocco. Yes, Morocco, Northern Africa. Luckily, she's done work in Tunisia before, so she speaks Arabic. She's going to take her amazing talents with pollinator conservation to Morocco. This document was very much a team effort, and first need to acknowledge the editors with Xerces Society, that included Nancy, me, Sarah Hamilton Buxton, who's in North Dakota, Sarah Morris, who's in Portland, Oregon, and is a desktop publisher extraordinaire, and then May Code, Stephanie Frischi, contributed lots of information regarding pesticide issues. Then, of course, I have to acknowledge the truly massive contributions by your very own Leslie Cooper and Ryan Diener, who did so much work on this document, probably more than me, because, of course, they are in Arkansas. They're working with you folks every day. They have the in-depth, detailed knowledge of Arkansas crops and ecosystems that this document required. So my thanks to those, to you two for your amazing work on this document. This handbook helps us understand pollinator diversity. There are many, many different pollinator groups, thousands of species, including butterflies in the upper left, moths in the upper center, flies in the upper right, beetles on the lower left, wasps in the lower center, and then in the lower right, the most important pollinators, the bees. The early portions of the handbook help tell you a bit about pollinator life cycle. For instance, the butterfly life cycle with its 4 stages of egg, caterpillar, egg, I think you can see my cursor, egg, caterpillar, pupa, adult. And we actually have a whole section, a brief section on monarch butterfly biology, given the big interest in conserving them within NRCS. But the handbook also teaches you about the life cycle of bees. Similar cycle, egg, larva, pupa, adult, the same 4 stages. The handbook also talks about the diet of our various pollinators. For instance, what do bees eat? And it turns out that bees are the only pollinators that consume both pollen and nectar. Many of our other pollinators consume only nectar, so for instance, butterflies. There's this handy table early on in the document, I believe in the introductory paragraph, Table 1, titled General Pollinator Habitat Requirements, in which it's pretty much summarized really nicely for some of our major groups. I'm just showing you some of the bees and the butterflies, but it also covers other groups and tells you what they need. For instance, bees need pollen and nectar, and it also talks about the structures that they need to live in. By the way, very importantly, pollinators need flowers all season long. The bees, for instance, need it to provision their nests and fuel adult activity. We need host plants all season long for the caterpillars and moths and butterflies.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What's up? Oh, your timesheet is still in the save status.
Uh-oh. Okay. Okay, back to the webinar. Having a diverse set of flowers is really, really important, because pollinators don't just need food in March or July. They need it all year. Very few of our flowers bloom all year, so it's going to be really important to plant a diversity of flowers. Leslie, take it away.
Thank you, Ray. To introduce myself, my name is Leslie Cooper. I'm the Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Coordinator. As Ray said earlier, I'm in the state office, and I work for Quail Forever. It's a partnership position with NRCS and Quail Forever. Ray did an excellent job of setting the stage for our presentation today, and I am just going to be covering this first chapter and then another section later on. But in the first chapter, of the handbook, we provide advice on recognizing specific habitat resources so that they can be factored into, conservation planning. Some landowners may already have existing habitat for native pollinators on or near their land. And, areas that are managed for diverse native plant communities really support a tremendous diversity of pollinators. This can be in open areas, wooded areas, or marginal areas that may be currently mowed. Pollinator habitat can be integrated into many conservation practices that aren't necessarily specifically for pollinators. And in a row crop setting, creating pollinator habitat near fields not only helps ensure successful crop pollination, but also helps support pest management by creating habitat for natural enemies of crop pests. Ray will go a little bit into this later, but what it does is these habitats support diverse predatory and parasitoid insects that help reduce crop pest populations. So through this, the focus of this handbook is pollinators, and though it's not necessarily beneficial insects like the main focus, the pollinator habitat that is created can also be used for discussions with the landowner for integrated pest management systems or IPM. So when assessing pollen and nectar resources, it's important to assess what's already there and what species of plants are heavily visited by bees and other pollinators. This includes insect-pollinated crops, as well as flowers and forbs and buffer areas, forest edges, hedgerows, roadsides, natural areas, etc. And insect-pollinated crops may supply abundant forage for short periods of time while they're blooming. And they should be factored in when you're creating that overall plan if the landowner is interested in supporting native pollinators or managed honeybees. However, for pollinators to be most productive, nectar and pollen resources really need to be outside of the period of crop bloom so that it ensures a consistent food source for the pollinators throughout the growing season, spring, summer, and fall. And this is why all of our recommended seed mixes include multiple species that bloom throughout the growing season. And occasionally landowners have remnant prairie sites or other degraded habitats on their property. They may just need to implement some management practices like thinning and burning to get a response from the seed bank and create native pollinator habitat on their property. And not all pollinator habitat needs to be planted, so it's important to recognize that. We never want to have soil disturbance on these remnant areas because we could completely destroy the seed bank for some rare and endemic species. We also may provide an opportunity for annual weedy or invasive species to germinate and take over the area. Some remnant areas like glades are very sensitive to soil disturbance, so it's important to keep this in mind when planning restoration actions. For example, we wouldn't want to bring in heavy equipment to remove cedars on a glade. Present-day forested and grassland landscapes that are managed with thinning and burning can provide pollinator habitat that supports a variety of insects, birds, and other wildlife all throughout the growing season and over winter. And you can contact your local Farm Bill biologist to visit the site and determine if there are any sensitive or remnant areas on the landowner's property. And the handbook also lists several habitat assessment guides that you could use as well. One is the Arkansas Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide for Pollinators, and Xerces also has several general pollinator habitat assessment guides available on their website. And these documents are also linked in the web version of the handbook. There are actually 7 natural divisions or ecoregions in Arkansas. The recommended native seed mixes that Ryan Diener will talk about later were specifically designed to mimic the natural species composition of these ecoregions. These ecoregions were shaped by natural disturbances like flooding and fire and grazing from buffalo and elk, and that influenced the composition and diversity within these landscapes. Understanding how these natural cycles help to maintain the diversity can really help guide planning and help improve pollination and pest management in our agricultural landscapes. Ray did a pretty good job of giving you a taste of the diversity and complexity of native bees, but I'm going to kind of dive in just a little bit more because it is very important. They're the subject of the book. There are approximately 4,000 species of native bees in North America, and they're highly diverse in their nesting behavior, color, size, and what they forage on. And to support populations of native bees, protecting or providing nest sites is as important as providing floral resources for them to forage on. Similarly, if butterfly habitat is a management objective, like the monarch, you have to have those caterpillar host plants to support robust butterfly populations. And it is ideal to have nesting and forage resources in the same habitat patch, but they don't necessarily have to be. They just can't be too far apart. Here in Arkansas, it's estimated that we have approximately 600 species of native bees, though a complete species inventory has not been completed yet. And to demonstrate the diversity and complexity of native bees, this collection represents about 200 species of native bees that are found in Arkansas. So that's really only about a third of what experts really estimate we have here. When understanding bees, so on the right is that squash bee that Ray was talking about. It's really important to distinguish between generalists and specialist pollinators. Generalists, like the managed European honeybee, can forage on a variety of native and non-native plants, while specialists, like the squash bee, can only forage on certain species or families of plants. And then as a general rule of thumb, the more plant diversity, the more insect diversity you can support. So that's why it's important to maximize diversity in these habitat plantings so that we can support a variety of native bees and other beneficial insects. So I've mentioned solitary and social bees before. Most of them are solitary, which means that each female constructs and provisions her own nest all by herself. And bumblebees are the best known native social bees. And, there are 47 bombus species in North America. Unlike the managed European honeybee, they only form annual colonies, so only the queen overwinters. They are cavity nesters, so typically they're found in abandoned rodent nests, but occasionally they're on the surface, under, bunch grasses or in a tree cavity. And they are very efficient and effective pollinators because they're capable of sonication or buzz pollination. This means that they're able to vibrate at a certain frequency and they're able to extract pollen from anthers. I kind of like to explain it like a salt shaker. So they're only able to do that while honeybees are not capable of that type of pollination. About 70% of them are ground nesting bees, and they dig in bare or sparsely vegetated soil, which is why, fire kind of comes back into effect, so it's not too thick. The configurations of the nests vary greatly. They can use flat ground or vertical banks. There are also wooden tunnel nesting bees, so this makes up the other 30%. And many of them use abandoned beetle burrows, or they chew out the soft pith from dead stems. Elderberry and blackberry are some examples. Joe pieweed and sumac are some other examples. And this graphic, it helps visualize how last year's growth on a planting can provide overwintering habitat for stem nesting bees. This graphic was developed for native plant gardeners, but is still appropriate for larger scale pollinator plantings. Solitary bees, they don't have, young or stores to protect like honeybees, so they're never really defensive, even close to their nests. They usually fly away or they hide. It's important to retain or encourage, as many naturally occurring sites as possible, and we can create new ones where appropriate. And protecting ground nesting bee sites is one other reason why we really discourage heavy disking or a lot of soil disturbance. Appendix F in the handbook It's double-sided, and it provides a summary of some of the common and specialist species that we have here in Arkansas. In the table, 6 families and 43 genera are included in the table, and there's different columns, and it includes nesting sites, sociality, timing, and abundance of these different bee groups, and it has been adapted to be a handout for outreach events. And Ray, if you'd like to continue.
Coming back on, okay. Chapter 2 of the handbook covers protecting pollinators in their habitat. And the big emphasis, the big message of Chapter 2 is minimize pesticide use to the best of one's ability. And this is not a radical statement from a nonprofit. This is standard NRCS policy in that it makes sense both from an economic standpoint and from a conservation standpoint to try to make the application of herbicides, pesticides, etc., as efficient as possible, so that any pest species, pest plants, pest insects can be dealt with, allowing production with a minimum of harm to other life forms. So one of the best sources of guidance on this topic is this planner note in Chapter 2 about telling folks, giving guidance on how to do pesticide planning and risk assessment. And it does direct us to Agronomy Tech Note 9, which is a substantial tech note about preventing or mitigating potential negative impacts of pesticides on pollinators using IPM, integrated pest management, and other conservation practices. One of the other neat highlights of this chapter is this attractive graphic teaching us how pesticide formulations differ. On average, the granular soil incorporated pesticides, like shown at the bottom of that bar, tend to be less hazardous to pollinators because they're sticking in the soil, whereas as you go up the bar towards wettable powders and dusts, things that can really carry quite a bit both through the air and through the soil and through the water, that tends to be of a greater hazard to pollinators. Additionally, there's an important planner note recommending the planting of pesticide-free buffers between crops and pollinator habitat. We fully expect most farmers to continue whatever pesticide use on their crops that they need to have their livelihood. We encourage them to put pollinator habitat nearby. But if that pollinator habitat is immediately next to the crop with no buffer at all, then there is a greater chance, quite obviously, of some of that pesticide drifting from the crop into the pollinator habitat, thereby harming or even killing pollinators. So it can be a great idea to plant a pesticide-free buffer. Usually you'd want to have it grass dominated, not put in many flowers. You're hoping that the grassy area, the grassy buffer, helps to catch some of the pesticide runoff. If you put flowers in the buffer, then the pollinators would be attracted to the buffer, and they would be right next to the crop at that point. So keep those buffers grassy, but that can be a great practice for multiple reasons. Chapter 2 also deals with how to manage habitat a little bit, including talk about grazing and fire and haying practices like that. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of grazing. Grazing can promote wildflower diversity. Obviously, if done right, it can maintain healthy grass and can provide a diversity of habitat for pollinators. Obviously, the other side of the coin is There can be risks from overgrazing. With overgrazing, wildflower diversity can decrease. The highly palatable wildflowers would disappear in that situation. The stems for nesting bees and overwintering sites, and even some of the food sources would get trampled or eaten. And then soil compaction by really huge herds, densely packed herds of livestock, can harm the underground nesting sites. So that's where prescribed grazing comes in, of course. One of our practices, pollinators can benefit greatly from prescribed grazing, and also benefit from prescribed fire. Fire, of course, kills invasive trees. Here in Oklahoma, one of our absolute greatest problems is the invasion of eastern red cedar. I know y'all have that in Arkansas too. I know you've got a lot of them. I don't think, maybe not as big of a problem as here in Oklahoma, but it's a big deal. I have areas on our land where prairie was turned into cedar forest and all the flowers disappeared. So mechanical control, in our case, followed prescribed fire was necessary to enhance pollinator habitat. Prescribed fire increases bare ground for ground nesting bees, and prescribed fire will often increase floral production of native wildflowers. The risks of prescribed fire is that it can kill many pollinators in multiple life stages. It can eliminate stem nesting sites for multiple years, and it can cause, of course, the short-term loss of pollen and nectar. Let me make it clear, I'm a big fan of prescribed fire. I've done prescribed burns in 3 states, I guess, Florida, Oklahoma, and Iowa, and we did 10 burns on our property earlier this year. The big BMP we have for prescribed fire in the handbook is try not to burn an entire property at one time, because when you do that, you risk killing entire populations of pollinators. We do expect when you do a prescribed burn, you're going to kill some things. You're going to kill some. Odds are you're going to kill some critters hanging out in the grass, hanging out in the stems. But if you only burn a portion of your property, maybe a third, a quarter, a third, a half, then it's very unlikely that you'll eliminate any populations. Chapter 2 also covers beneficial insects a little bit, the predators and the parasitoids. Now, obviously, it's a pollinator handbook, so we don't go into great detail on the beneficial insects. But beneficial insects contribute very greatly to natural pest control, and we talk about protecting them. If you want to learn a lot more information about beneficials, Xerces Society has produced 2 documents. The one on the left is a free download titled Habitat Planning for Beneficial Insects. And it's, I can't remember how long, but it's a substantial document, lots of details on how to manage for beneficial insects in a farm setting. And then on the right is shown the cover of a book that is not free, unfortunately, but available for sale on farming with native beneficial insects. One of the best publications of its kind. Chapter 3 talks about enhancing and developing new pollinator habitat. And it's mainly about planning the where and the what. So we have sections in there about marginal land. It can be logical if farmers find that parts of their property are marginal, then not worthy in most years of crop production. Maybe that's where they could put pollinator habitat. It won't affect their bottom line much if they put it in marginal land. They should also consider adjacent land use. They should consider aspect, how much the direction that the sloped land is pointing towards, so that'll affect sun exposure. They should also consider their soil and the size and the shape of the area that they want to plant. The photo here on the right is a photo of part of our farm, and you've got a pond in the right, obviously, and the land immediately to the left of the pond was scraped, the topsoil was scraped away and put in the pond dam. So when we acquired the farm 4 years ago, we had an awful lot of bare ground. very few good things were growing in that soil, even though it had been there for 20 years. So this is, right now, we are installing, we have installed and are installing a lot of pollinator habitat. It was marginal for sure due to the horrible soil. We're actually amending the soil in places and planting pollinator. And of course, I alluded to this before, that it's extremely important when we plan pollinator habitat to plan for flowers that are blooming throughout the year. No one flower blooms throughout the year. So you want to plant a diversity of species. For instance, on the left, we've got very early in the spring, we've got trees blooming like maples and willows. In the middle, we've got some of our early summer flowers like beard tongues and lobelias. On the far right, we've got the fall wildflowers that are so attractive to the migrating monarchs and other butterflies. The handbook has a nice table on blooming periods for trees and shrubs. So if your producer is interested in some woody plants, this gives guidance on when these trees bloom so that they can plant trees with a variety of bloom times. So the previous one was for the large trees, and now this is for shrubs and small trees. And as you can see, the great majority of our trees and shrubs bloom very early. Most of our wildflowers do not. So that's sort of complementary. If you want to have blooming throughout the season, the best way to get the early season stuff is planting trees and shrubs. It's not all just about flowers. Pollinators do use native grasses for various purposes. They're butterflies, caterpillars that use grasses as their host plants. And many pollinators will nest in tufts of grass. And of course, the grasses are important for other aspects of the ecosystem, important for other wildlife. So there's a table showing you what grasses, rushes, and sedges to consider. And also a table on the blooming period for specialty crops. For instance, up near the top, 2 crops that I'm growing right now, 3 crops I'm growing right now, blackberry, raspberry, and blueberry, tells you when they bloom. And then the note is pointing out that sometimes farmers worry that if they plant wildflowers for pollinators that bloom at the same time as their crops, that those wildflowers will take the pollinators away from the crops. And that is not true. Research shows it's more the opposite. So pollinators that bloom the same time as your crop is a good thing, not a bad thing. And again, I have blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries. We on our farm, and I'm pleased to have wildflowers that are bringing the pollinators in towards those crops. This chapter also covers plant selection and seed sources. And one important piece of guidance, of course, is plant native plants when you can. And we have multiple reasons for that. But one of the absolute most important is your native plants are much less likely to become invasive. That's item 4, of course. When you're planting exotic plants, some of them they're more likely to take off and take over the landscape. The native plants have less of a chance of doing that. Eastern red cedar being an exception. Okay, Leslie, your turn again.
Chapter 4, we start getting into the early successional and other open grassland habitat. Native forb and grass establishment, some woody establishment, and long-term maintenance for these sites. I like to think of this chapter as kind of the meat and potatoes for pollinator habitat planning. I'll provide a brief overview of what's included in this section, but if you're looking for a more in-depth training, you can talk to me and I'd be happy to schedule one for your team or your field office. Most of the state should have been in on the 2-hour trainings that we scheduled, but due to COVID, we weren't able to do the field portion. If you're interested, I can also send you the recording link to that training, and that one was held virtually for the Northwest area in March. So when planning pollinator habitat, it's important to remember that it may be protected or enhanced with management of existing plant communities, or it can be created with new plantings. And it's really important to assess those existing conditions before we get started so that we can decide, which is the best course of action for the landowner, to provide that pollinator habitat. Here we go. Open grassland habitat is a conservation priority because many species of wildlife depend on this habitat type, and they are experiencing population declines. Open grassland habitats need periodic disturbance to persist. Otherwise, we do get that woody encroachment from cedars, like Ray was talking about. And often we use the term early successional when we're referring to, pollinator habitat or open grassland habitats. But really, remnant prairies are actually very late successional, and they're more precisely termed climax communities because these plant communities are dominated by these kind of late successional forbs, like prairie blazing star, rattlesnake master, and other grasses. And true early successional habitats are really dominated by annual weedy forbs and grasses. And over time, they are replaced by these late successional species, but they take longer to establish. Early successional habitats are also important, for all sorts of pollinators and other wildlife. And when we're creating the newer areas, we want to try to focus attention on building larger blocks of habitat. 5-acre blocks or larger will provide the most benefit to the greatest number of species, both vertebrate and invertebrate. But larger openings allow more sunlight to reach plants, leading to more flowering, which equals more food for pollinators and other wildlife. And adding or restoring habitat that's adjacent to these, existing open habitats can have a broader impact than scattered patches, but really both are valuable. And when planning pollinator habitat, it's important to consider site prep. It's really the most important, part to anything. And you need to plan for the long term. So you need to do site prep, planting, and then long-term maintenance. And it really needs to be kind of in the discussion early on. Establishing habitat usually takes about 3 years to see a majority of the species that are included in that native seed mix. So it's important to discuss that with the landowner so they aren't disappointed during the first growing season. This long waiting period is normal. The native seedlings have some species that establish quickly, but as the stand matures over the next couple of years, the more of the perennial species begin to show up and bloom. And the extra effort required to establish these perennial plantings is really offset by the long-term benefits that they provide, and they really are quite beautiful. And I've said it before on the slide, but I'll say it again. Site preparation is the most important part of establishing and managing pollinator habitat. The importance of good site prep cannot be overstated. The primary goal of site prep is reducing weed competition. For seedings, an additional goal is providing a firm, clean seed bed and reducing weed competition for a full season prior to the planting is really critical for the planting success. And depending on what's currently growing on the site, 2 seasons of weed control may be recommended. For example, areas that are, heavily invaded by Sericea lespedeza may take more than 1 year of site prep. And because tilling brings, weed seeds to the surface where they can germinate, we want to avoid that. And it also damages those nesting sites. Haying or grazing or even burning a site prior to or after herbicide application is a great method for removing litter and preparing that seed bed so that the seeds are able to germinate. And never apply nitrogen during the planting year. Nitrogen tends to support non-native weeds that are less adapted to Arkansas soils. Native plants are adapted to the local soil conditions, and it's better to make a seed mix of species that will do well on your site than try to amend the soils to a certain pH. Ray's example on his own farm is a bit more of a special circumstance because he mentioned that, that topsoil was scraped away. Soils that test high in nitrogen or phosphorus will pose issues for native seedlings because they encourage excessive weed growth, and some native plants are actually sensitive to or harmed by high phosphorus levels. The handbook also dives into no-till methods of seeding native plantings and the basics for native seed mix design. There are also 5 seed mixes that are ecoregion appropriate that are included in the Appendix C that Ryan will cover later in the training. And the entire handbook is really illustrated with beautiful photos. Ray's showed some, he's talked about it, and I just can't say it enough. There's, a great specific section detailing these different seeding methods. A native seed drill, a broadcast seeder. And also in this chapter, there's a section that considers monarch butterflies when planning and managing pollinator habitat, since I know a lot of landowners are really concerned with the plight of the monarch. And in this section, it does include herbicide application methods, native milkweed species, and considering their migration when implementing these management practices so that you minimize impact on their migration. And we don't have time during this training to go in depth, and all of these things have been mentioned before, but the handbook does provide an overview of the options that are available to planners and landowners to maintain this habitat. These sites can be managed with fire, grazing, mowing, or light disking. Fire is the preferred method since all of these other management actions really just mimic fire as a disturbance. When managing these native plantings, it's also important to limit the amount of disturbance, like Ray said, to 1/3 to 1/2 of the total habitat so that we provide refugia for pollinators and other beneficial insects so that we give them a place to kind of retreat to. And also monitoring. It's really important for adaptive management. No 2 sites are the same. So it's important to adapt our management strategy to really how the site is responding. For example, we can strategically use prescribed fire during certain times of the year to target woody encroachment or to knock back native grasses from dominating the herbaceous planting. Most of what we've talked about so far focuses on herbaceous plantings because one might argue they're the most important, especially here in Arkansas. But there is a section that does cover woody plant establishment and maintenance. These plantings are actually most effective when they're planted along with other native forbs and grasses. And it's really important to, maintain diversity in these plantings as well. Planting clusters of these different species rather than a single species creates a more diverse canopy, both structurally and florally. So there's different blooms, and it also helps reduce weed competition, and it's more effective in reducing soil erosion. I know that a lot of landowners that are, creating habitat for bobwhite quail use this as kind of a cubby headquarters. So it's important to remember that we're not trying to do super large areas of this type of establishment for habitat, especially for pollinators. And when you're selecting a native seed mix, picking the species for this is very similar to picking the seed mix because you want to take existing soil, light, and moisture conditions, into account when you're selecting this. And when you're planting them, you want to provide a lot of room for crown development and spreading. And you want to space it for, the full spread and height at full maturity for the species. But if you plant it more densely, it actually helps, reduce weed competition. So planting them along with companion species of, other native forbs and grasses, it can help them, mature and go on. And remember that it may take several growing seasons for some of these woody species to reach the flowering stage, but those, annual and perennial forbs and grasses can actually provide forage and shelter right away for those pollinators and other wildlife while those are getting established. Ray, I think you have one more section.
Yes, I do. I want to very briefly summarize Chapter 5, which focuses really on a few tables that list NRCS practices. And I'm going to go quick because we're a little behind schedule, and I think it's my fault. So, very hastily, Chapter 5 focuses on these tables that run down the various practices that are relevant to pollinator conservation. As you can see on the left, we've got the conservation practices listed. We've got the codes in the middle. And to the right, description of why that practice, how that practice is relevant to pollinators. We have that for the primary conservation practices. I also want to point out that 420 wildlife habitat planning, this nice new practice, is included in this list. Also, we have a table for supporting conservation practices and how they are relevant. For instance, brush management. That's been a big deal on our land. We got rid of 900 cedar trees with help from the Payne County Conservation District. There's also a table that sort of turns it in reverse. It's a reference guide. If you know what food you want to provide or what resource you want to provide, and on the left, the resource showing is food, but other resources would be nesting habitat, overwintering habitat. Once you know what resource you want to provide, then you can look to the right to see what conservation practices will provide those. And that's it for that little section. Now it's time for Ryan.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tables and things that we'll find in the appendix, particularly the native species lists that we have back there, as well as some pre-made seed mixes that Leslie mentioned earlier that are made specifically for the different ecoregions of the state. So we have some extensive native plant lists. We have and very detailed native species list. So there are 5 different tables that break down the native species by type in the back of the handbook, and this is all in Appendix B. There's the native forbs list. There's a list of native grasses, sedges, and rushes, a list of native shrubs and small trees, as well as a native trees list, and then finally a native vines list. And all of these are species that would be beneficial for pollinators if planted here in the state. So these following tables, they include native plants that are important components of our natural communities here in Arkansas. The full native species list includes some species that may not always be widely commercially available or may not be commercially available year by year. But we did go through these lists specifically for the forbs and grasses, and we did try to really narrow it down to native species that were commercially available most of the time, if not all of the time. So most of these things that you see on here should be able to be bought from seed dealers. Maybe not every seed dealer, but it is commercially available and out there. It's also important to note that these species lists found in the handbook are not a full list of species found in Arkansas, and other species may be used, but just make sure you consult with a biologist or another professional and make sure that if you use any other species that it's truly native to the state and would do well within your area and it's appropriate for conservation plantings here. When you're planting field borders, filter strips, insectaries, nectar corridors, bee pastures, any kind of riparian buffers or hedgerows, anything that we're trying to increase wildlife and pollinator habitat on, including our native pollinators and natural enemies, predators and parasitoids of crop pests, we want to include as many flowering species as possible. So our pollinator plantings include species, ideally with overlapping bloom periods, appropriate for those site conditions, whether that's soil type, light regimes of that area, moisture regimes, and pH, even natural pH of that site. And obviously, we want to make sure that these are going along with the landowner goals as well. So a lot of times our native plantings rarely require fertilization. And we'll look here on this table, we actually show pH range for most of these species. And a lot of our native species have pretty tolerant ranges. And if we're selecting sites we're selecting species that are actually native to our region of the state. Most of those species are going to be adapted to the pH ranges that you're going to find, unless we have a site that's been heavily disturbed for a long time in the past. It's important to note that transplants are containerized or bare root, whether that's herbaceous plants like forbs and grasses, or we're talking trees or shrubs. They may require some supplemental irrigation and potentially fertilization for establishment. Establishment of a full or adequately dense perennial planting generally takes a few years to fully come in, but once that's established, it will persist basically indefinitely if it's managed well. For the most part, only perennial plants are included in the species list. There are certainly annuals and biennials in here, and those are an important part of these mixes, but we want the seed mixes to be heavily perennial. Those annual and biennials provide some pop and color in the first year or two, but those perennial plants are the ones that really come in and help that stand maintain itself over the long term. In the past, we've seen some failures or folks getting upset because we had seed mixes or people bought mixes that were heavily annuals and they look good for a year or two and then they basically go away. So the species lists include a lot of details about the species found in those lists, and this is true for all of the different species, whether it's herbaceous ones or shrubs or trees. They go through everything from bloom periods, flower color, height at maturity, shade tolerance, pH range, drainage, and even wetland status. So you see here, they're separated out by columns. That first column is showing the bloom period from very early to fall, late fall. The color that you can expect from that species, the height at maturity, and these are reported in feet. The shade tolerance going from full sunlight to full shade. Some species are pretty particular about that, so it's important to note you wouldn't want to put a species that requires full sunlight necessarily like in a narrow planting right up against a stand of trees where it's not going to get much sunlight. Here's that pH range that we mentioned. Again, most species do show this. We didn't have the data for every species on this list. And this is really kind of indicative of these plants and where they're found naturally. And so some plants naturally like high or low pH ranges. Some of them are very particular and actually only grow well naturally on those high or low pH range sites. So if you do have a situation like that, we can certainly make a seed mix that will grow well on that site. Then we also have the drainage. So from very dry to very wet, it shows that for each species. Some of them also have a wider range than others. Some of them are very particular. And then the wetland status. So this is all data off of the USDA plants database. And finally, each of these also has a pollinator preference shown here. And we have icons indicating if they're used by either native bees, European honeybees, butterflies and moths, beneficial insects, hummingbirds, and for nesting and overwintering of bees, butterflies, and other insects. So all of that information is shown here in this column. That can be pretty beneficial, especially if you do have a landowner that's that really particularly wants to benefit one category over another. We have had landowners come into the offices before, and they really want a planting to say to benefit hummingbirds. We can certainly use this table and help that out. Or if you have a landowner that's especially interested in attracting a diversity of butterflies or native bees, or if you do have a beekeeper come in, we can use this to certainly look at seed mixes that'll be very, very beneficial for introduced honeybees as well. So once we get past that, in another appendix in the back of the handbook, you will find ecoregion seed mixes. So we have seed mixes made for the coastal plains, the Delta, Ouachita and Blackland prairies, the Ozarks, and the Arkansas River Valley. So The seed mixes in this handbook, they've been designed to be at about 30 seeds per square foot as a seeding rate. So these, you can certainly hand these seed mixes out. They're in a printable form, front and back. So they're easily used if you want to just use these to give to landowners as a recommended seed mix. If a seed company doesn't have some of the species identified in the seed mix, the way we made these, they can simply be dropped without necessarily replacing, as long as the mix is still at or above a goal of about 25 seeds per square foot. That'll certainly help ease the ordering process for landowners and help ensure that, you know, unwanted or non-native species are not substituted in the seed mix on accident or by the seed company. And if plants identified in these mixes are not available and replacements have to be made if we have to drop too many species, be sure to select plants from the handbook that have the same bloom periods and growing requirements as the unavailable species. And again, those can be found in Appendix B. And again, we did try to make these easily usable so they can be printed on a single page, double-sided, to be handed out to folks. And just note that some seed vendors will not have every species included in these seed mixes. That's common and known when we try to make a diverse seed mix. But again, we make it at a high enough rate to where if they have them all, great. If not, they can certainly drop some. But if you do want to make some changes, or if a customer wants a custom seed mix, be sure and consult with the local biologist, whether that's with Arkansas Game and Fish Commission or the Quail Forever Farm biologists, to help them make any changes, or make sure they look at any changes that a vendor wants to make sure that the seed mix still is going to meet our requirements. Most of these seed mixes here are made with about 60 species in them on average. And they still have a diversity of native grasses, but they're at very light rates. So these high diversity seed mixes meet all of our NRCS program specs, and costs can range depending on which seed company they order through. But you know, these are seed mixes that we've actually been passing out for a couple of years now, and we're seeing costs, you know, anywhere generally between $200 and $250 an acre. We do have some other additional resources that are helpful as well. We get a lot of questions from landowners purchasing native seed for the first time. They don't know where to go. They get asked questions by the seed vendors about what they need or if they can take something out. So we do have this helpful document that covers some of those frequently asked questions. And a lot of this information and stuff can be found in our planner notes, which you can see here, planner tips within the document and within the appendices. So some of that same information is provided there, but we can certainly get this native seed mix buyer's guide out and into the hands of everybody at the offices too. Those are all very common questions, and it kind of goes through what people need to do once they get a seed mix and how to send it into the seed companies, and goes through some of the language that they'll hear from either vendors or from our documents or from the planners themselves. So we've sent that document out a little bit, and people seem to really like it, and it's really helped make sure that mixes that are getting purchased are actually meeting NRCS specs. So you see there that planner note. There is a section in the handbook that also lists various seed and plant material vendors. You see here on the right side of the screen, that's the seed vendors list found in the appendix in the handbook. It's a fairly comprehensive list. As most of you know, Arkansas Game and Fish and the QF biologists also have a native seed vendor list of seed vendors commonly used by folks here in the state as well. So all that's available, and we can make sure that those things get out there. And again, the seed vendor list in the handbook should be easily able to be printed out and handed out as well. A couple other resources. The Arkansas Monarch and Conservation Partnership has also recently created 5 handouts for the best management practices for pollinators. And we'll send these documents out, or you can find them on arkansasmonarchs.org website. You know, these documents cover pollinator friendly practices on a few different types of properties, from rights of way, row crop farms, forested property, pastures and hay meadows, and it also covers habitat establishment on private lands. So those are good resources as well, especially if a producer's just kind of interested. These might be good handouts to let them look over and read through if they have an interest in doing some pollinator work. Good introductory documents for sure. And then just as a reminder, there are biologists out there for help. The Quail Forever Farm Bill biologists located across the state. They're capable and willing to help with any of the pollinator plantings or pollinator habitat establishment across the state, as well as the Game and Fish Commission private lands biologists. And with that, I'll pass it back to Leslie and Ray.
I'll go very quickly through a handful more additional resources. I just deleted a few to make this quicker. There's an Appendix H with links to additional resources. Appendix H is 4 or 5 pages. So Nancy Adamson, with help from the rest of us, but primarily Nancy, I think, developed this really long list of other resources for you to hit. So it's pretty great. One of the resources I'll talk about, because I worked on it with Jim Baker, your state biologist, was the Monarch Plant Identification Guide that's associated with the Monarch WEG for the western coastal plain of southern Arkansas, East Texas, northern Louisiana. And this book is 104 pages. Obviously, it's an NRCS product. It's for southern Arkansas, and it is available, obviously, as a free download at NRCS Monarchs. Why would you get this guide? Because it is a guide to dozens of the plants, pollinator plants that are great for monarch butterflies in the West Gulf coastal plain. And almost all of these species are in Arkansas. Again, NRCS Monarchs, go toward the bottom of the page and you'll find it under West Gulf coastal plain. Also, I want to encourage you to hit the Xerces website, xerces.org, because we produce a heck of a lot of documents on every topic under the sun with regards to pollinators. So once again, please visit xerces.org. I want to go ahead and do acknowledgements. I want to thank Helen Dennison very much for coming up with the idea of developing this handbook and inviting us to work on it. I want to thank the co-editors of the handbook, who I mentioned earlier, my colleagues with Xerces, and of course, Leslie and Ryan as well. A special thanks to Nancy Adamson for the massive amount of quality work she did on this document. I think this is her magnum opus, and it's ironic that she's gone to a new position right after it, because it's such a great handbook in my opinion. I'm giving her and Ryan and Leslie and my co-authors the credit. We want to thank our reviewers, 4 folks from your state office on the left, James and Troyce, Keith and Doug, and also folks from various entities within Arkansas, Theo, Allison, Melissa, Coleman. Want to thank our photographers who generously donated so many amazing photos. You folks in Arkansas are very lucky to have some amazing photographers. Steve Dezan, Eric Hunt, Coleman Little contributed so many of the great photos in this handbook, and we very much appreciate it. I'm a big fan of their work. And finally, as a Xerces Society employee, I want to thank the people who help keep us going. Most importantly, our Xerces Society members, but also the various corporations and trusts and foundations that support us, and very importantly, the NRCS. We're very thankful for your support for keeping us active in pollinator conservation. And I believe that's my last slide. Leslie, you have one more.
Yes, if I can unmute, hold on. And we do have some questions. If we'd like to kind of chop that one up, then Ray and Brian and I can answer them.
Okay, well, I mean, I can jump right in and address Aaron Shelton's question, if that's all right.
Please do.
Or start to, at least. So Aaron asked if there's any native flower species that can be evergreen or while in the rosette stage throughout the fall and winter months, especially with some of the mild winters we've been having, and what the recommended site prep might be for like fescue or Xerces, and then that might be able to kill that stuff without hurting those, and mention using remedy to control Lespedeza. So there are quite a few native species that maintain green rosettes throughout the winter. A lot of those are biennial species, but some of the perennial ones will do that too. A big one that comes to mind is oh no, I'm gonna forget about it. Penstemon. So penstemons will certainly maintain greenish basil leaves throughout the winter months, even further north than here. I've had good luck actually applying herbicides over them in the winter. So even those species that have green looking basil leaves through the winter seem to certainly still actually go dormant and not be moving nutrients after we've had a killing frost or two. But at that point, even after killing frost, fescue is still green well into winter, and you're still able to do herbicide treatments to take that fescue out. I don't expect you're going to have a lot of those issues in a field that we're doing site prep on to completely convert over. Any species that you likely have in a fescue field or a field full of fescue and Xerces especially, probably not going to be species that I would worry too much about. Even if we did kill some of them, they're probably going to be a lot of those native annuals that will come back up from seed readily from the seed bank. But if you do have fescue in a pollinator field that you've already planted and it comes back in, and maybe a couple years later you want to do a winter spraying to take that fescue out, you should be good to go as long as you wait until after a killing freeze, even on those native species that maintain green basil rosettes. As far as the Xerces, having to treat Xerces during the growing season with like a triclopyr product, and honestly, I highly recommend using Pasture Guard for Xerces. It's much more effective than even remedy. That's more a matter of trying to do targeted spot treatment if possible. And that's how you want to try to not kill the plants that you've paid to plant there. If you can do spot treatments with, hand herbicide sprayers or off of an ATV, that's going to be your best bet. Otherwise, if it's so thick that you're having to broadcast spray a field for Xerces, chances are there's not a ton of good native plants in there either. So that would be kind of a start over or a new planting before you go in. You want to try to control as much of that as you can for at least a couple years, especially if it's thick Xerces stands.
I want to ask, is Brent Clark still on the line? I am interested in your question about how does pesticide impregnated fertilizer affect pollinators. That's one I haven't thought of much before, and so I guess I'd like to learn a little bit more about the pesticide. But I'm imagining these are granular fertilizers, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I was curious, you was in your topic when you was talking about pesticide buffer areas and stuff like that. I didn't know if there might be some possibilities of using the pesticide impregnated fertilizers. But I think you're pretty limited to what particular pesticides that you can use in that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll be frank. I know very little about this topic, so it's a guess on my part. Given that these are the granular fertilizers, at least they're probably going to get integrated into the soil. And if you remember, during one of my segments, I talked about the different modes of application for pesticides, and the dusts tend to be the greatest risk to pollinators because of their ability to spread far and wide, whereas the anything granular that goes right into the soil obviously can have an effect, On some pollinators, gosh, ground nesting bees, I'd be really curious about that. And I apologize, I haven't seen the literature on it. But less threatening than the dusts, I would say that much. Ryan, Leslie, you have thoughts?
I also don't know very much about this topic, but I suppose another thing would be, determining whether or not it was a systemic pesticide. So, if it's going in with the fertilizer and the plant's taking it up, would the plant then, have that insecticide within it? And, insecticides really don't discriminate. So it can kill the beneficial insects as well as the pest insects. I feel like that's why a lot of, kind of buzz is going on about, these IPM systems, so that, by creating this native pollinator habitat alongside, row crop farms, then you get these beneficial insects, the predatory insects, the wasps and everything that go in and naturally take care of these pests. So that would be the only other thing that I would note, is whether or not it was a systemic pesticide or not.
Ryan, any thoughts?
I think you guys covered that pretty well. That's definitely a side of pesticide application that still needs more research out there. And as these technologies develop and improve, it's hard to keep up and on pace with research to look at the overall effects on the system as a whole. So that's something that I expect we'll probably be seeing more of in the coming future, hopefully. But a great question. And again, I think Leslie covered it well. It's more about trying to do IPM and looking at, do we need to apply that beforehand as a systemic pesticide, or can we do crop monitoring and pest monitoring throughout the season and apply as needed directly on those pests that are in the field to help mitigate those issues, as opposed to having to do it off the bat.
Folks, do you have any other questions? Any questions at all? Any comments? Feel free to talk or to type them in. I'll give you another couple seconds to think, or to type one in. Okay. Well, before we end, Helen would like to say something. Helen, you're on.
Thanks, Ray. The one thing I really wanted to say is this has been an amazing project, and the hours and hours of work that went into this from Nancy and Ray and Leslie and Ryan is incredible. I think that we have a product here that is probably one of the best handbooks in the nation, and it's all due to their work and their expertise. And I just want to say thank you so much. And I am very sure that this is going to be very helpful to our staff, as well as our clients and even other states. So I just wanted to reinforce that and just say a big thank you to everyone who worked on this project. And, I hope that I hope it's useful to you, and that it will be a document that will definitely provide the technical information we need concerning pollinators here in Arkansas. So thanks to everyone. I really appreciate it.
Helen, thank you so much for those kind words. And because I feel I did less on this document than many, I feel I have the ability to praise the document in a humble fashion. I agree with you. I think this is the best pollinator conservation handbook I've seen, thanks to Ryan and Leslie and Nancy and your leadership, Helen. So Arkansas NRCS, with the handbook, with the Quail Forever folks that you have available to help you out, I really think, and I can help if there's anything that you need. I can help from Stillwater, Oklahoma. I think you're well positioned to be a national leader in pollinator conservation. And Helen, thanks again for asking us to work on this document. Ryan and Leslie, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, just thanks for tuning in. And, this webinar has been recorded, and I will be sending up follow-up links. And if, you don't get it from me, just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to send them to you.
Yep, for me, again, same as Leslie, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Ray, for all of the great work. You're too humble. You were tremendous help in getting this all put together. And again, I just want to reemphasize to the field staff, we certainly have capable field biologists out there to work with. And if you have any questions at all about pollinator habitat, wildlife habitat in general, site preparation, seed mixes, species selection, site selection, the partner biologists that are there in your offices are very capable of helping and handling a lot of those situations. So please reach out to them and use them as much as you need. They really enjoy doing this type of work and enjoy working with all of you. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, everybody, very much for attending, and have a great week. And we look forward to helping you any way we can with pollinator conservation in Arkansas. Bye-bye.